Today we're going to be speaking with Matthew Tai, known online as Laowhy86 or Sea Milk, who's an American blogger well known for living in China. Matthew, so great having you on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
So, I mean, I guess first, just to kind of orient our audience, how did you end up living in China for the period that you did?
Yeah, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version, but basically I was, bored out of college. I didn't really want to settle down and get a job immediately. I had just backpacked through Europe. I was like, why not go travel somewhere else? China wasn't even on my list. I was like, why not do some sort of gap year, maybe teach English abroad for a year and then come back home and then get a job. So I initially thought, Taiwan sounds pretty cool. Interested in maybe learning Mandarin Chinese might be useful in the future. So I put up my resume on some Taiwanese job sites, and it just wasn't hiring season at the time. But I guess some mainland Chinese companies also poach like potential employees on those sites as well, because I got a phone call from this like tiny, tiny little school in Guangdong. In Huizhou, actually, the picture behind me is the city behind me. Called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to do a year here instead?" And I didn't really consider. I was like, China's seems like a pretty crazy place, but at the same time, why not go on another adventure and try it out? And sold all my stuff. I was just a young, 22-year-old kid, and hopped on a plane and went over there.
And I have a number of viewers who have called me sometimes when we'll open up our phone lines, and they say that they are in China teaching English.
Mhm.
What other things do Americans sometimes do in China when they're there?
Sure, yeah. Like, so I didn't continue teaching English the entire time. It's kind of just it's the way you get when you get off the plane. It's what you do, right? But a lot of people, they'll oversee factories. They'll do consultation for like what's it called, like quality control. They'll do help with immigration visas and stuff for people that want to move abroad. There's people that'll start their own bars. It's not an open market, but it's a huge market. So a lot of people, especially during China's golden period, which I call like kind of like when I was there, 2008 up until, I mean, I left in around 2018, but up until like 2014 was like a golden period for people to go there and try out a new market, go try a new product, try to get Chinese people interested in something that they can find a home that is not already popular in China.
So there's how to even broach this next part. I mean, there's no shortage of reporting about an authoritarian status quo in
Hmm.
China to different
Hmm.
degrees and affecting different people. We have the Uyghur population specifically, and we've done interviews about that. Then there's people like you who are Americans who may be there on a temporary basis, and your circumstances presumably would be different than someone who is from China and living in China. Just to
Yeah.
get us into this, can you give us a general overview of what's accurate about the reporting that we hear about the Chinese government and what maybe is less accurate, generally speaking?
Sure. So when I was initially there, I mean, I didn't set out to cover any news or influence anything about China, other than the fact that I wanted to put out videos to show people that it's not the boogeyman. Like people are like, "What are you doing over there? Why did you move to such a crazy, communist authoritarian country?" And I just wanted to put videos out there to be like, "Listen, it's not as bad as what you think, or maybe the things that you're thinking of are not actually true, at least in my life, from my perspective, or my Chinese friends, right?" So that's what I initially did. And I actually moved into, as my channel got bigger and stuff. And my business partner, people might know him out there, Winston. He's the first China vlogger, the first guy to actually get on a VPN and put out videos from China. I happen to be the second. We met each other. We started doing TV shows. We started doing travel documentaries. And again, our goal was we set up a small motorcycle business where we built our own custom motorcycles and we rode through the country. And we didn't go through the places like that, people normally see, Shanghai, Beijing. We went through the rural countryside. We went through the small towns, the third tier cities, all these places that don't get reporting. So we wanted to show a human face of China. And we didn't set out to do that from the lens of like, oh, this is so unfair the way it's portrayed. We just wanted to show reality, right? So from that perspective, we developed our own insight onto what was actually happening in the country. And as we traveled more and the more people and relationships we developed, the more we realized that Unfortunately, a lot of stuff that people talk about in regards to China are more of a macro scale, but China has a lot of issues, and a lot of them, I'm going to say the majority of them do stem from the Chinese government. And when we would go to some of these villages and find out that maybe an official, for example, a local official, went unpunished after raping a 14-year-old girl and then having her murdered, we would be shocked to hear this. And it's weird because the people in this village, they normally probably wouldn't talk about that to anyone else, but because we were foreigners that showed up, there was some sort of like trust or understanding that we would understand. We would kind of get their perspective, and we wouldn't stick around long enough to face any repercussion. And the more people like that we met, the more beholden we felt to tell the story of actually what's happening. When we were in some of these far-flung areas, we would find out that the People's Liberation Army of China would go and harass families and harass tribes, like Mongolian tribes and things like this, for money, to just keep them down. Their languages were being banned out of schools. The people would tell us stories about how they felt trapped because they're an ethnic minority and China doesn't allow them mobility, or doesn't allow them to do really anything, especially upwards mobility, owning their own business, making money. And we found out that there's actually a lot more than what, Western media is portraying. I think the Western media portrays a lot of, financial based things, or will focus on one specific issue, which is great. I mean, like I absolutely focus on the Uyghur issue. It's a huge thing. I personally know Uyghur people that have gone through this. I'm in personal contact with people that have lost their families to the genocide in Western China. But also, like, the stories of the Inner Mongolian people, the stories of the ethnic minorities in the South. I became very dedicated to kind of compiling these stories in my head while I was there, knowing I couldn't report from China at the time, and then saving them for when I ultimately had to leave China.
So let's dig into a couple things you said. You said you in some of the third tier cities you wouldn't stick
Mhm.
around long enough that there would be repercussions, and then
Sure.
you just said some of the stories you knew you couldn't report on
Yeah.
while you were there. Why not? Why did you have to leave the cities? What would the repercussions be? What would happen if you tried to report on them?
So what happened was, when we would have the nicest of intentions. Let's say we show up at a third, fourth, fifth tier city somewhere down in Guizhou province. Let's just pick a random province in the south. And what would happen is we would get, of course, you show up, you're a foreigner from the middle of nowhere, like you're in the middle of nowhere, and people crowd around you. They want to talk to you. They want to take pictures of you, all that kind of stuff. That's normal. But when you sit down with people and you start sharing a meal, when you start talking about things, and you're not inciting these conversations. They're bringing these things up, and they start talking about what life is like there, how they haven't received any of the poverty, alleviation type funds, how their town is going to be flooded by a dam that the government's putting in, even though that nobody wants it there. Those conversations perk the wrong ears. So, like, people will be in the background, people will be around there that have to report to local Communist Party officials. And what will happen is they'll find out, through the grapevine quite quickly, that there's foreigners there and that they're not supposed to be there, because there are entire areas in China where foreigners are not even supposed to be. And you don't hear about this. This is, again, you wouldn't see this on reporting, you wouldn't read about this anywhere, but there are whole areas that are basically blacklisted off because the Chinese government doesn't want another Xinjiang story to break. They don't want another Tibet story to break. They don't want people talking about issues that are caused by the government leaking out to potential journalists, even though we weren't. So you would have a situation where you'd be in an area, and then you'd kind of get this inkling, this feeling that, number one, the hotels won't even let you stay there. They're like, no, we can't register a foreigner. Whether they got tipped off by someone or not, it's a different story, but they just won't even register you so you could stay there. So you're forced to leave anyway. But when you get the feeling that people are starting to, like, make phone calls, and then you start to see police officers and things like this, it's time to leave, because the times that we did stick around, we've been told by police officers that you actually have to get on your bike and just get the hell out of there.
Wow.
And what we noticed sometimes is, when we would be in these areas later on, we would see actual police officers, sometimes with notepads or their phones, at certain kind of designated points on the road from where we just left to the next city. So we'd be monitored the entire time. And you realize that, especially when you travel around rural China, you realize that it's very much akin to the security apparatus that maybe like a place like North Korea would have. It's just not as in your face, and it has
Right.
more money, right?
Right.
So you're minded the entire time, and ultimately we found out really how bad it can get when we were up in Inner Mongolia, and our hotel room was just full of SWAT team people
Wow.
with body cameras and automatic weapons. That's when you realize that I'm here trying to film some horses and talk to some local people about their way of life, and then there's a SWAT team and detectives in my hotel room interrogating me about my every movement in the entire country.
Now, when something like that happened, after they're done interrogating you, do they leave and then you just kind of finish what you were doing?
No, that's the worst part, is that there's a system of, I don't know, I think they want to instill some sort of paranoia, because what they'll do is, I'll use the example in the hotel room with a SWAT team. What they'll do is be like, okay, we didn't really get what we wanted. They list off where we work, what our contracts were, where we shop 2,000 miles away, by the way. They know everything about you, and they want to get in your head, because later on they'll continue to harass you. So you think everything's fine. You'll leave super early the next morning to go on to your next destination, and then you get stopped by the army. Like that day, that later that day, early in the morning, we got stopped by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, who made us take apart all of our equipment, check everything, take photos, told us not to smile in the photo, stand in front of everything, and they would leave. And then immediately they would come back and do the exact same thing over and over again
Wow.
until you just get out of their jurisdiction, right? At the same time, after your trip is over, the police still come to your house. They come to visit where you are. They come to interrogate you. Why do you own a drone? Why are you doing this, right? And it's this constant kind of harassment, and it's kind of the moment you realize that, hey, I'm not welcome here with a camera. They
Right.
don't want people, they don't want foreigners walking around with cameras talking to people. And so that kind of false security you've built up over 10 years, you watch that shift with the current regime, by the way. This really came to fruition maybe around 2015. It started getting really bad. um, but you watch this happen, and it breaks your heart, and it also makes you feel like, what if the Chinese government's trying to hide this stuff so badly? There's so much under the surface that people don't actually know about, and that's what I feel beholden. I feel beholden to the people to talk about today, because I get thousands of Chinese people reaching out telling me, please keep your voice up, please keep talking about this kind of stuff, because we can't talk about that stuff,
Right.
right?
The social credit system. I've read quite a bit about it, specifically in the context of the Uyghurs, and we interviewed Jeffrey Kane about his book, and he writes specifically about how it's sometimes used to restrict the movement of the Uyghur people, and in other ways. Can you talk a little more generally just about how, for the average person living in China, and maybe there is no such thing, maybe it's very different, urban versus rural, or whatever the case may be,
Sure.
how does that system affect the average person?
Yeah, so the social credit system, I've done a huge, basically a documentary series on the whole thing. What it is it's more of a dynamic thing that's being tested out. So I think a lot of people, I wanted to go out there and dispel this myth that it's some sort of number that hangs over your head, like on Black Mirror or something. It's not. It's not that at all. In fact, it was rolled out in this place called Rongcheng in Shandong in northern China, and it was the first place that they rolled it out. And it's no secret. In fact, I found the government documents that are out there in public, and I translated them myself, and that's what I based my video on. And what it did was teach me how it works, from a test standpoint, testing out on this city and its people, which it's mandatory there, but it's not necessarily something that's used elsewhere, right? There are other cities. In fact, I reached out to a lot of people around China to ask them if they even knew about it. I would say a good chunk of people hadn't even heard about it. But then there were other cities in Chengdu, and then I talked to people in Anhui. I talked to people all over China that did know about it. In fact, their city had some sort of version of it. And what it is, it's really trying to reward good behavior with a point-based system, and then punish bad behavior. And unfortunately, when I went through those documents and I spoke to people around China, it looks like it's trying to reward good societal behavior, which is probably it's a fine thing. It's like, I don't have a criminal record, so my score goes higher, right? But unfortunately, a good proportion of those crimes, of those things that lower your score, are things about speaking out against the government, about posting messages of dissent on forums or on chat groups, having weird religious beliefs, as they call it, cult-like religious beliefs. It turns out that a lot of it is aimed at reducing personal freedom so that people don't dissent against the government.
once you're sort of branded or stigmatized or assigned, a lesser status, whether it's specifically point based or not,
Mm.
how do you recover from that? How can you get back to sort of being on everyone's good side, so to speak?
Well, unfortunately, if you're on like the low, this is what I pointed out in my video series is that when I spoke to people, there's no, even though there's a sliding scale of points, if the government deems you the lowest score, you just get the lowest score.
Mm,
There's no rule of law or rhyme or reason in this. I think people really rely on this Western lens of like everything works to a certain standard. Everything works because of rules and laws. That's not really how it works. Like if China wants to throw you the lowest score and make you like ostracized in society, they'll just do that right off the bat, right? Especially if it's something about the government or just throw you in jail. But if a person is like labeled at the bottom, I mean, your kids probably aren't going to get into schools, right? You're not going to be able to get employment opportunities at least above the lowest, blue collar kind of construction type jobs, even if you're well educated. Um, and to get out of that, if you're at the bottom, you're not going anywhere. But to get out of that, you have to do good deeds, right? You have to participate in local government activities. You have to, I mean, there's some clauses in these documents that say if you rat someone out, basically, that's doing bad things, then you get to move up. It's basically a really restrictive way of keeping people in their spot. They don't really want people to go up or down necessarily.
mm.
Um, it's almost like there is no recourse for people to exit once they've already been deemed that lower caste.
Last thing I want to ask about in the couple minutes we have left, you weren't there during the COVID lockdowns, but it's been widely reported that, there are these videos of the vehicles pumping out disinfectant on the street, which is, of course,
Mhm.
of questionable or no actual preventive value for COVID whatsoever. The COVID zero strategy of a sort of close to complete lockdown, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk a
Mhm.
little bit about whether any of what you read about in the context of COVID was surprising based on your experiences when you did live there?
No, honestly, like when I saw the heavy-handed approach of, Xi Jinping's government, really not just when he took over, but like later on when he achieved full power within the Chinese government, when he consolidated that power through the anti-corruption drive and things like this, I wasn't surprised to see what kind of methodology was coming out with the zero COVID policy because there's a thing within the Chinese government, especially true under the current leadership, is that they can't be wrong. So when the Chinese government set out to say, "Hey, look at the world failing with the COVID response. We're going to be the ones that kind of deal with it very harshly in the beginning, but we're going to show the world as kind of as a brand how this authoritarian style government actually works, right? We can take away people's personal freedoms and stuff, but isn't that better than dying? Isn't that better than millions of people dying?" And honestly, it kind of worked in the beginning. I think a lot of people were like, China's pretty brutal, but at the same time, look at how they've dealt with this. A lot of people didn't die in comparison to the rest of the world.
That's, I
And
guess, if
that
you
kind of,
believe the numbers, right? I mean, there's also a question as to,
obviously,
yeah, but of course.
yeah, I'm always speaking like a normal reader that's
Yes.
just looking at the news, right?
Yeah, right.
Let's pretend like you believe the numbers. So then people are in a position to say, you know what, this other style of governance, maybe they're not going to jump on it and be like, yeah, China's the future, China's the way, but they'll look at it and say, you know what, maybe this kind of reporting that I see about China is not really accurate.
Right.
And what happens is, unfortunately, when you get new variants, when you get something that spreads so crazy like Omicron, and then the rest of the world has found out ways to deal with it, whether it be mRNA vaccinations, things that have been proven to work, China didn't adopt those things out of to save face, to say that we have our own homegrown method. We have our own vaccine, which is not very effective, by the way, against
Right.
Omicron. We have our own lockdown strategies, and we've already put in the work. So we don't really have to suffer through this anymore while you guys still have to. And the rest of the world's kind of saying, well, what do you mean? Like, it's not, number one, it's not as, the new variant's not as bad. Number two, a lot of our population is vaccinated. And number three, we have an actual dynamic approach on how to deal with it that doesn't necessarily restrict people's personal freedoms. And China says, nope, nope, blinders on. We have zero COVID. We have zero COVID. We have zero COVID. And that can't be proven wrong because in the top down leadership in China, there is no there is no saying that the government was wrong about their strategy. They have to be right and see it through. And we're seeing where Xi Jinping is currently trying to get into his third term. He has to make sure that his policies not only worked, but nobody has any sort of dissent or disapproval with them.
Right.
So we're looking at a situation now where zero COVID is either going to change and rebrand to save leadership face, or is going to continue down this very draconian route.
We've been speaking with Matthew Tai, known online as Laowhy86 or Sea Milk. Matthew, so great speaking to you and really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much, David.